Welcome everyone to NCUI's Get Out the Vote and Integrated Voter Education National Project Celebration 2022. One vote, one family, one voice at a time. This program includes welcoming remarks from the National Urban Indian Family Coalition and a panel discussion from our 2022 grantees, and offers a guidance on available voter education and civic engagement resources. This session will end with a call to action and engagement strategies for UIOs to energize the one voice at a time, one voice at a time, one vote at a time, get out the vote message. Next slide. My name is Molly Siegel. I am a technical associate with the Technical Assistance and Research Center, better known as TARC at NCUI. Joining me today from NCUI are Jeremy Grabner, our policy analyst, Zipporah Polar, our director and technical assistance, Sabu Kojiman, technical assistance associate, Kayla Emmerich, technical assistance associate, and Rachel Dio, communications associate. We are honored to have you here today. We kindly ask that you place your name, organization, tribal affiliation, and title into the chat box. In addition, we welcome any feedback you would like to provide about your webinar experience in our survey, which can be posted in our chat box. Next slide. For those of you that are unfamiliar with NCUI, here's a little background. The National Council of Urban Indian Health, also known as NCUI, is the national nonprofit organization devoted to support and development of quality, accessible, and culturally competent health and public health services of American Indians and Alaska Natives living in urban areas. NCUI is the only national representative of 41 Title V urban Indian organizations, or UIOs, under the Indian Health Services in the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act, or IHCIA. NCUI strives to improve the health of over 70% of AI/AN populations that live in urban areas supported by quality, accessible healthcare centers. Next slide. As a reminder, in this session, all mics have been muted upon entry. Also, please note the QR code on the bottom of the slide. If you can scan it with your phone or tablet, you will be taken to our session feedback survey, where you can leave comments on what you liked most and how we can improve these series. Your participation and feedback are always greatly appreciated. Next slide. This slide features some information on how to use Zoom. For those that are familiar with Zoom, you'll have seen this already. At the bottom of your screen, you can find the chat box feature. Click on that and enter in the chat, and please enter your comments and questions there. Next slide. Additionally, feel free to use the icons and emoji in the chat throughout the Solutions Center. Next slide. As shown on the agenda, we begin our opening remarks at 1:05 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, followed by our wonderful UIO grantee panel at 1:20, and a brief call to action and engagement strategies at 1:50. We will end with our evaluation and upcoming events and adjourn promptly at 2 p.m. Next slide. I would now like to introduce Jeremy Grabner, our policy analyst at NCUI. Jeremy Grabner works as NCUI's Congressional Relations Policy Analyst, where he focuses on legislative analysis and congressional advocacy on behalf of UIOs. He has worked in both the nonprofit and private sector on several political campaigns, most recently as the campaign manager of a Chattanooga mayoral race. He has a BS in International Business from Southern Adventist University and a master's in public policy degree from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Let's please welcome Jeremy.
Thank you, Molly. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As Molly said, I'm Jeremy Grabner. I'm the Congressional Relations Policy Analyst, and I'm really excited to hear the amazing stories as we celebrate our UIOs who played a critical role in raising the voice of Native people in the last election and their continuing efforts to increase engagement. When it comes to conversations around democracy and the importance of civic engagement, I'm always drawn to this quote by a political philosopher, James Hyland, where he describes democracy as a system of decision-making of which all those who are subject to the decisions made have equally effective power to determine the political outcomes of decision-making. And I think that this quote is particularly important when we're discussing the political and policy decisions impacting American Indians and Alaska Natives, as it is critical to have Native voices and representation in the decision-making process. The AI-AN population is around 2% of the United States population, The 2018 census estimates were about 6 million, but we expect that the 2020 census will show an increase of several million. Now, existing research shows that historically Native voters have turned out to vote in higher rates for tribal elections than in non-tribal elections. However, because our elected officials, whether it be the President of the United States, all the way down to your local city council member, they all are making important policy decisions that impact Native peoples. Increasing Native participation in these non-tribal elections will lead to better responsiveness to the needs of Indian country. In the 2020 election, we saw a record number of Native voters show up in key states such as Arizona, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And this had a lasting impact, resulting in major wins for our Native communities. These triumphs are extremely important because an increase in representation in office directly affects the future throughout the country. There's a record number of 6 seats in Congress that are held by Native peoples, as well as some first-time wins at state legislators. So Stephanie Byers of the Chickasaw Nation became Kansas' first transgender lawmaker, and Christina Haswood, Navajo, became the youngest person in the Kansas state legislature at 26, which makes me feel like I'm a little bit underachieving in life. But this critical Native vote reaffirmed that American Indians and Alaska Native issues should be the priority for lawmakers. And it resulted in urban Indians being made a priority by the White House by including UIOs in the president's executive order for missing and murdered Indigenous peoples and the Tribal Nation Summit Progress Report, as well as the first time ever proposal for mandatory funding for IHS in the FY23 president's budget. And so the work that we're doing with our Get Out the Vote and integrated voter engagement project is more important than ever with an election coming up in November and ongoing efforts by states and municipalities to disenfranchise Native Americans. I see that Susan's on this panel, so I'm sure she'll get to mentioning the recent legislation in Arizona around proof of address and its impact in disenfranchising some of those who live on reservation communities. And so as we're seeing these suppression efforts from state and local governments, it's critical that we maintain our advocacy and educational efforts to increase Native participation in our election. I would now like to introduce Rio Fernandez from the National Urban Indian Family Coalition for his opening remarks. Rio Fernandez is an enrolled member of the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe and serves as the Director of Civic Engagement with the National Urban Indian Family Coalition. He manages their Democracy is Indigenous initiative, working with over 20 urban Indian nonprofits around the country to empower and amplify the voice of the urban Indian community. He also directs their Weaving Our Web Digital Equity Fund, which works to close the digital divide in urban Indian America. Thank you for joining us, Rio.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Jeremy. As he had just said, my name is Rio Fernandez, and I'm the Director of Civic Engagement with the National Urban Indian Family Coalition. I wanted to thank Nikui so much for having us and giving us some time here to speak with y'all and highlight the work that we're doing and take part in the work that you guys are doing. A little bit of broader information about the National Urban Indian Family Coalition. We are a coalition of 45 total nonprofits in 22 states, found across 34 cities. We were founded in 2003 to help address the inequity and the invisibility of the urban Native population that I think so many people on this call understand and can relate to. More than 70% of Native people live off reservation, but when it comes to policy decision, when it comes to civic engagement strategy, when it comes to outreach along those lines, so often it's focused solely on just reservation communities, tribal governments, and there's very little attention really often paid to the majority of urban Native people. Our executive director, Janine Comino, knew that that was a big issue and wanted to address that, and which is what gave birth to the NUIFC. And we got into the civic engagement space in 2018, a little bit before I got there. In 2018, Janine and the rest of the NUIFC team pulled off what she often refers to as the 6-week miracle. We received funding from Wallace H. Coulter Foundation in, I believe, early October, late September, to essentially stand up and create a civic engagement project for different urban Indian nonprofits around the country. Our organizations worked really hard to make that a success. I think so many of us understand that, when given the opportunity, when given a challenge, challenge and stuff. So it's so often that these Native organizations can rise to the challenge. But going into 2020, with myself brought onto the team, we talked a lot about how do we make sure that we get everyone at the table. We have more time to plan now. We have a little bit more runway than we did in 2018. How do we make sure that this project is reflective and inclusive of everyone involved in urban Indian America? And Janine, while we were talking with the Wasatch Culture Foundation, specifically highlighted NCUI as an organization that if we wanted to do this work, if we wanted to make sure that we were representative of the entire community, if we were making sure that we were connecting with everyone, that NCUI was absolutely someone we need to have at the table. And we're still so thankful that you guys decided to join with us and continue along with this work. 2020, the Democracy is Indigenous campaign was a huge success for us and our cohort of 26 urban Indian organizations in 18 states. So some of the highlights from that work in 2020 included a 21% increase in voting turnout in the counties that we were organizing in from 2016, 25 million individual engagements across social media channels for all of our Democracy's Indigenous work. The cohort hosted 400 plus civic engagement events where they connected with over 175,000 people across those events, getting those people informed about registering to vote, getting them informed about how you actually cast your ballot, and above all, making sure that all these events were safe and engaging, even despite the COVID-19 pandemic. But as we, are obviously really proud about what happened in 2020, we're obviously already looking forward, just like y'all are looking forward to, about how we make 2022 just as successful. We are really focused on how we can continue this work, how we can continue to grow it. So this year, the cohort is going to be made up of 24 organizations in 17 states, and we're going to be continuing under our Democracy is Indigenous messaging, that banner, and that idea that this core tenet, the idea of democracy, this system that we all are participate in, is something that is inherently Indigenous. It's something influenced by our ancestors. And then also that the idea of anything that goes forward in this country, anything that we are building towards, anything election-wise that we want to continue to grow, has to include the Indian perspective, has to include our perspective, and making sure that we feel engaged in some ownership over the process and what's happening next. So as we've done in the past, the Democracy is Indigenous program and the initiative is focused on centering the urban Indian nonprofits that make up the NUIFC's cohort, because we know that those organizations understand and connect with their communities the best. They understand them in a way that we do not. We are not going to reach out to Michigan and tell the organization we have in Detroit how to organize Detroit, because we don't know how you would organize in Detroit. The same goes in Arizona and Phoenix. The same goes in Portland. Like everything we do is built around the idea that these urban Indian organizations know how to lead, know the community, know what's best for them. And so we really try to be really cognizant of that and making sure that what we are doing is providing them resources and providing them support, but allowing them to flourish and make the decisions that they know to make on their own. So essentially what we do with the NUIFC, with the Democracy is Indigenous, is we bring them together to have an opportunity to connect with one another, learn with one another, share resources with each other. We provide them artwork, which we're hopefully going to unveil here pretty soon, which we're really excited about, the Democracy is Indigenous artwork for 2022. We are also going to be providing them voter registration handouts. They're personalized to each state. So as I said, we're in 17 different states, 17 different election systems, essentially. We are providing them handouts that walk through each of their states' election laws, how you register to vote, when you can register to vote, what the deadlines are, can you register online, can you register to, can you vote by mail, going over all of that in these individuals' handouts that our centers will be able to include and distribute to the community. Those will also have QR codes to help them register to vote online. And we're also going to be distributing swag packages. I believe there's a couple photos of the t-shirts and cups and different things that were made with the Democracy is Indigenous branding on this slideshow. And so we're going to continue that work, getting those out to the community so they can be distributed. And yeah, all of this work all this work is meant to push and build on our understanding and belief that that resources follow policy and policy follows elections. We understand how powerful the results of an election can be. We understand how powerful and engaged and mobilized and organized community can be on putting pressure on getting resources for our community. We, I think, are all aware of the disparate amount of funding, resources, support that the Native community often gets compared to other communities, compared to the society at large. And the NUIFC, the organizing, this work, everything along with the digital equity work we're doing is all meant to kind of close that gap, is meant to center, empower, and uplift the organizations that we work with. And we're just really happy to be able to be here in this moment with you guys, learn more about the stuff you guys are doing, so continue supporting the work you guys are doing. Wanted to just, again, thank you guys so much. And if you guys have any questions about the National Urban Indian Family Coalition, anything about the Democracy's Indigenous work, please feel free to visit our website, nuifc.org, or you can email me directly at riof@nuifc.org. We're always happy to talk about the work we're doing. We're always happy to see if there's some way we can partner, if there's some way we can grow the work that we're doing together. But that's about all I've got. I just wanted to, again, thanks so much for having me on, and I will hand it back to Molly.
Thank you so much, Rio and Jeremy, for those amazing opening remarks and such powerful messages that I think our grantees really drove home this year. We would now like to welcome and present a photo montage of this past year's 3 grantees: the Urban Indian Center of Salt Lake, Native Health, and Urban Intertribal Center of Texas. We are grateful for all the hard work this past year. Please bear with us as, perfect. Thank you for that wonderful montage as we go back to the slides real quick. Next slide, please. I would now like to introduce this year's grantee and panelist: Raylan Montoya from UIC SLC, Adam Shorter from UIT CT, and Susan Levy from NH Native Health. Please put a heart in the chat box and welcome them. Okay, panelists. So I asked everyone inside the registration for questions, if they had any, or if they had any issues. And if at any time you have any questions for the panelists, please type them into the chat box. And your questions take priority over any questions that I gave to the panelists prior to. So our first question comes from Kansas City that I saw this morning, and not to throw the panelists too much of a doozy this morning, but their question was: the state of Kansas does not allow for voter registration drives. Any suggestions for other ways to register? And when I read that, I had to step back a little bit and look at what's happening in Kansas. On July 1st, 2021, a House bill added new restrictions and penalties for some for touching somebody else's ballot box, distributing ballots, or helping someone turn in a ballot, or altering the postmark on an advance ballot. Under the law, false representation of an election official is a felony crime with punishment up to 17 months in prison and a $100,000 fine. Organizations have suspended voter registration drives for fear of criminal prosecution because of the provision, making it a crime to engage in activity that gives them the appearance of being an election official. So I'll ask that question again. The state of Kansas did not allow for voter registration drives. Any suggestions for how they can register voters? And I know it's a pretty heavy question to start, but I did want to answer it. And if you are here who asked that question, I encourage you to come off mic and elaborate on. But I'm going to pose this question first to Susan from Native Health. Susan?
Hi, everybody. So my initial response would be, we're going to be trying something new, which will be with Western Native Voice, which will be voting kiosks. And I think it's not a voter registration drive. It would just be something that would be available in each of our clinics. I think that might work for them. That's my very first initial thought.
Thank you, Susan. Adam, any comments, or what do you think Kansas should do?
I mean, that is a tough one. For me, just really just kind of pushing that presence on social media, being unbiased when you do it. Yeah, like I said, that's a tough one. And Susan had a great idea as well.
Raylan, any comments for Kansas?
Just as Adam said, I think for me, with all the strategies that I used, was bringing just educating on how people can vote, how they can register, or where they can register, but staying out of me actually doing it for them. And with that, we use like business cards, and it had a QR code. And if they scan that QR code, it took them straight to the registration website, and they were able to register on their own.
Absolutely love these ideas, guys. I know that this past year and year prior and currently legislation and everything else, depending on your state, can be extremely difficult. So I think, I hope Kansas City is on here and maybe can take some of this, of what you guys said, and implement it. My next question is for Adam. Please give one word that describes what get out the vote means to you.
Thank you, Molly. So for me, when I think of one word that describes get out the vote, immediately duty comes to my mind. I believe it's everyone's civic duty to get out and vote, because it's one way to make your voice heard and to really express, what's important to you and what matters. And so voting, being duty, would be my one word.
Thank you, Adam. Love that. Raylan, what is your one word?
Mine was empowerment. It's really empowering to know your voice is being put out there, it's being heard, and that it does matter.
All right, Susan, what is your one
My
word?
one word would be awareness. That if people need to know what the issues are, and then they can actually register and be empowered and vote.
I love that. You brought like all three of them back together. All right, our next question, Raylan, what do you think is the most important engagement strategy when trying to get out the vote?
For me, I found it increasing the want or need of voting engagement was engagement activities. Once people wanted, like, we had to spin the wheel on one of our activities, and when people see that they can engage with what we were doing, they would come up and they would instantly come and talk to us about whatever it was. We used trivia and educated about voting rights and history for Native Americans, and that seemed to be the eye catcher for our community. And then after that, they were more willing to register to vote.
Gotta love interaction. Adam, was there any important engagement strategies that you think really spoke to voters to get out the vote?
So for me, and here in Dallas, what my biggest strategy was was power building. It was getting with the other underrepresented communities, like the African American community, the Hispanic community, and we all partnered together on spreading the word about voter education, where they can go to vote, the dates of when votes are for federal, state, local. It was just really a big collaboration to work together to spread the same message.
Susan, what do you think is the most important engagement strategy?
I loved what Ray Lynn did. I thought that was awesome. I think we are more in line with what Adam had done. So the power building, the education, working with All Voting is Local, Intertribal Council of Arizona. And we started months ago meeting with all different groups every week, which I think has worked really well in getting the word out to the community.
Appreciate it. Thank you, guys. And to everyone who's wondering who's speaking, make sure your view is side-by-side gallery mode as we go through the panelists, so that way you can see the faces to the voice. All right, Susan, you're going to lead up the next question. What does integrated voter engagement mean to you?
Really working with community leaders to get the messaging out, which will increase voter turnout and I hope lead to policy changes.
Very true. Raylan, what does integrated voter engagement mean to you?
Along the same lines, just working together for common goals such as voting participation and awareness.
Love that. All right, Adam, what does it mean to you?
Kind of the same thing. To me, it means educating our underrepresented groups in the voting process, getting groups engaged enough to understand how to complete their voter registration, where they can vote. Is it a federal, state, or local level of elections going on, and so on.
All really important messages, I think. All right, so we're going to start with Adam again this time. Are there any colleagues or individuals that you want to thank that have helped you over this past year with voting, getting out the vote, civic engagement?
For me, it would definitely have to be my outreach team. That is our outreach coordinator, Michael Tonkame, and our development coordinator, Jeremy Zahn. They really did a great job in being able to upkeep all of our posts on Facebook, YouTube, making sure information was correct, unbiased, and just really just spreading the information to everybody. They did a really great job.
Love that. Definitely takes the village. Raylan, are there any colleagues or individuals that you want to thank that have helped you with get out the vote this last year?
Yeah, so I have our COVID-19 coordinator, and she also does a lot of outreach. So she kept all the information. She kept making swag bags that we could do at every event. And then she was constantly handing them out to anybody that came into our clinic. And then my colleague, Dan Hampton, who is very knowledgeable about politics and any events that were coming up. So like the primary election that's coming up June 28th. But then also talk about caucuses and stuff like that and provide me all the information there. And then just my team that helped with the big events that I had happening without, oh man, there was just so many people that it was nice to have people stand behind me and share the same voice that I was trying to get out there.
Love that. Definitely COVID, anybody involved in that work behind the scenes, making sure, are you sick today? Making sure everybody knows that, hey, we need extra support over here. Those are some unsung heroes that sometimes don't get the shout out. So appreciated that. Susan, any colleagues or individuals that you wanna shout out?
I would obviously say Nikui for funding us, because that allowed us to purchase and do a lot of the things that we normally couldn't do. Intertribal Council of Arizona, All Voting is Local. And on those calls, it's the power building and it's the other community partners, which have really helped us tremendously. Obviously, the staff at Native Health to help us get the word out and all of our materials out to the community as well.
Gonna make me blush, Susan. Thank you so much. I'm gonna ask this next question over to Raylan. Are there any get out the vote messages or adages that really spoke to you?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Are there any get out the vote messages or adages that really spoke to you?
For me, as I stated in my year, it was a lot of the history of native voting. I learned that Utah, which is where our agency is located, was the last state to allow natives to exercise their voting right in 1962. My grandmother was born in 1930. So it was like, that was a huge eye opener for me. And that's, like I stated, I stuck on more of voting history and rights for Native people. And when I shared this information with the community, that it really grabbed hold of what they're thinking or what they didn't know. And it really opened up a whole box for them, and they're more willing to listen to me about voting, how to vote and when the next election is and stuff like that. So I think it was the history that did it for me.
Love to hear it. Susan, same question. Are there any get out the vote messages or adages that really spoke to you?
The democracy is indigenous. I think that one kind of summed it up, and we were able to build off of that message.
Yeah, that was really powerful. Just one sentence there. Adam, what about you?
They both stole my answer. But no, really just tying the history into it and the mission of democracy is an indigenous. There was a lot of people that really realized that a lot of nations and tribes have had democracy forever. So it was just kind of cool to educate them on that concept.
Love it. And I just want to remind our audience, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. We would love for you to have any questions for our panelists today, for anything that you might need or have questions on for getting out the vote and practicing civic engagement. Okay. Our next question, we're going to start it off with Susan. Are there any resources you would like to recommend supporting voter education work? And I know it's open-ended, so really think hard. What do you think is the basics, the most important?
Wow, that's a hard one. I think NCAI, nativevote.org. I mean, if you're talking about resources, I also think I'm always one that looks at everybody, all the other UIOs, their social media, getting different ideas and thoughts on how to engage people, different ways. So I think it's trying to be creative and engaging people. And I find that people don't look at our message, the same message over and over. So I've got to change it every time, every other time, and keep it fresh and interesting. I don't know. I don't know if that answers the question, but those are some different resources, would be NCAI and nativevote.org and things like that.
Definitely. And I want to pose that same question over to Adam real quick. Are there any resources that you would recommend? So what's in your toolbox that you're always going to be reaching for?
Google, just being able to Google information and using the internet. I know there's a lot of disinformation out there. So, I mean, just really kind of researching, doing the reading into it will help. Contacting your state voter registration locations, websites. I know that we contacted a few and they were able to provide us information. Anything that really is unbiased is really going to give you your best information.
I'm happy you said unbiased. That brings us to our next question, but I want Raylan to shout out any resources that she would recommend in her toolbox.
Same thing. It would be all of those that were already stated. I really relied on the Utah voting websites that were non-biased, specifically because that was the community I was working with. And then anything that included Native voting and culture that would help our community relate to.
And they just dropped in a resource guide into the chat box for our audience to go and check out and look for themselves a little bit more. Our next question comes from Rio at NUIFC. Have you all had experience with disinformation? Any recommendations on how to combat that as a trusted community member in the civic engagement space in particular? And I'm going to start that question off with you, Adam.
Kind of like I said a moment ago, you just have to really know who is an unbiased opinion, because when you try to get into the politics of it all, you have your left and your right, but really it's just staying in the middle and looking for the facts. So like getting back to saying, like, your state voting registration websites, your government websites, those can be good sources and tools.
Okay, I'm going to pose that same question back to you, Susan. What's your experience with disinformation in combating, to get the truth and get trusted messages out to the community?
So I would say the same thing that Adam said. And I think that Arizona, we've really kind of mobilized everybody to make sure that we're not, that all the information that we're presenting is true and correct, and working with the Arizona Secretary of State's office and everybody, all the different resources, and we all get together and are able to discuss that. And so kind of a united front. So the messaging is the same, the dates. So everything is correct, on point. And I think it presents a united front of correct information.
Yeah, definitely need that united front. Raylan, that goes to you last. What experience have you had with disinformation in combating that?
So just as everything, I kept out any kind of opinions. I stuck more to facts. Like one of our biggest posts were, to increase voter registration was to make a plan. And then I stated ways to make a plan. I kept out, any politics, any left, right, red, blue. And then that way, everything that I shared was true.
Yeah, definitely keeping it truthful and keeping that trust in the community. Very important. Thank you guys. And thank you, Rio, for posing that question. Our next question comes from Nikki McDonald. Would you please share what was included in your swag bags, products to share, etc.? Also, what information do you recommend to include on printed materials that are most important to distribute at Get Out the Vote events? That's such a good question. I'm going to pose that question over to Susan first.
That's a great question. So Nikki, this cycle is a little bit different than our previous voting cycle, and I think we'll end up doing a lot more. But currently what we've got are different stickers. We have 3 different stickers that we've done, and we actually hired some graphic designers so that we own the rights to those, and that we're rotating those through. We've given out water bottles with those stickers on it. We've also have the fans that were shown in the video montage that have been incredibly popular. And so have the stickers. We've gone through, I think, 30 or 40,000 stickers already. We also have, through All Voting is Local and Intertribal Council of Arizona, some voter education materials. And what we came up with on something that we created was a QR code that takes people directly to Arizona Secretary of State for voter registration. So a secure site, and that has been really, really helpful. We put that in every single thing that we push out of the agency, in our lobbies and at all events and in our food boxes. And we've distributed, I don't know, tens of thousands of those. So, and then they're also able to tell how many people are registering via the QR code. So I think that's been helpful.
That's really good ideas. I want to pose that same question over to Raylan next. Would you please share what you include in your swag bags and what you're putting on your Get Out the Vote educational materials?
Yeah, so we included, we really advertised for the primary elections that were coming up here in Utah. So we included the information for there. We included where, like I said, a business card with the QR code. And then that took you right to registering to vote or checking your registration status to make sure that you are on track to vote for the elections coming up. We also included any dates, like you stated, there was caucuses happening, there were small elections happening, stuff like that. And then we included some chapstick and sage bundles for people. And then we included that with our COVID-19 kits, because that's still a huge thing here. People are still looking for ways to prevent COVID or up-to-date COVID information. So we also included that too. And then for our other swag, we had cups and electronic fans. And the t-shirts were a big deal. People really loved the t-shirts, and then that's what got them to our booths and stuff, and they wanted one. And then we also had stickers and pins that we could give out and hand out to everybody.
Love incorporating that technology, but then also incorporating, that native voice in it with, the COVID-19 materials as well. That's really smart. Adam, would you like to share what's in y'all's swag bag and what's on your printed materials?
Sure. I mean, really, the biggest thing for us is, like they said, those t-shirts. Couldn't get enough of them. Everybody wanted to wear one, and you can even see in some of the pictures that were in the slideshow, a couple of our people attended a powwow and went back to El Paso, and Beto just happened to be walking by and said, "Whoa, that's a cool shirt," and snapped a picture with them. So really, the t-shirt was the best and biggest message to get out the mission and what we did. But we also did pins. People loved pins, writing pins. We got with the contractor, and they developed some pins for us that has "Democracy is Indigenous" on it. And then on the other side, a link to our website to the specific page on where they can go to find voter registration information. QR codes are also a big hit on our next round of t-shirts. We have a little QR code just on the back right behind the net where people can just pull out their phone, hit the QR code, and they're good to go. So really the QR codes, the pens, and the t-shirts were our biggest three. Other than that, we had like stress balls, because voting can be stressful sometimes, especially when you're waiting in line. And then just kind of I think we also had some of those fidget spinners that had the "Democracy is Indigenous" in the very middle of it. So really those were kind of the big hits.
I love that idea of putting a QR code on a shirt.
So one thing that we did for our office also is we did mouse pads, big rechargeable mouse pads. That way when clients come into the office, they would see it, and then they are always asking about, what is that? Like, and so that was a huge hit and then we've done trivia knockout games is what it's called. And so we've created get out the vote swag baskets for the top winner. And as they would get all of our get out the vote swag. And so we saw that was a big turnout too. People wanted to participate to get all the get out the vote stuff instead of just one thing.
I love that idea, all of it together, and then also incorporating it into the office. So when people walk in and they're like, "Oh, what's that?" It's not just, "Hey, you could win a shirt," but, "Welcome to the office, and let me tell you more about this," and you can scan it here. It's a great question. Thank you so much, Nikki, for asking it. My next question is a little bit lighter, but I think you touched on it a little earlier with voting information and when, your grandmother was allowed to vote, Raylan. But was there any voting information you learned this last year that surprised you? And I'm going to pose this question first to Adam.
So information, not necessarily, but more of just the fact many voters not really being in the know of what's going on statewide or locally. A lot of them focus on the bigger picture for federal, but we kind of explained, like, state and local elections are really a big deal too. It's that stepping stone up to the federal to the federal level. A lot of the communities talked, heavily emphasize federal elections policies. Sometimes, state and local elections are just as important. So we tried to explain, as minuscule as it sounds, it does play into the big picture.
Okay, I'm going to pose that question over to you next, Raylan. What was any voting information that you learned from this past year that surprised you?
So a lot of it was, going back to before Utah, it was probably the 15th Amendment that allowed people to vote regardless of race. However, for Native people, that wasn't true. When that was passed, it actually came down to the state that made the decision whether natives were allowed to vote, which for a lot of natives, the answer was no. And then the Snyder Act of 1924 came, which gave natives the right to exercise their vote. But it took over 40 years for that to completely be implemented by all states. And as stated, you know, Utah was the last one to implement that exercise for natives to vote in 1962. And so I think that was like, oh man, is that like, it was just crazy for me to hear all this stuff. And so, yeah, that was probably the biggest thing I learned there.
That's really,
Oh,
it's
sorry.
crazy. I love history, but
Yeah,
it's crazy how
and
much
I
they don't
think
teach.
the thing that I learned the most between history and bringing awareness to Native voting rights, it actually helped me form my testimony as to why I vote now. Like before it was, oh yeah, I vote, that's it. I didn't really have a reason. I would never speak up about why I voted. You know, it was just something I did essentially. But now it's like I have my own testimony as to why I vote today. And I like to share that now with the community and anybody I come across. And I think it gives it more authentication that way.
It really does. You really, you know, you spoke it beautifully. And Susan, same question to you. I know Adam and Raylan both had really powerful statements as to, you know, what they learned that surprised them, but what, you know, took your breath away? What surprised you?
I think both of what they said, but especially what Adam said is that the races at the local level, the local and county and state level are really important and definitely have an impact. And I think people often look at the federal races and then forget those, but those local ones are pretty important.
Yeah. And our next question, I'm going to be posing it back to you, Susan. Thank you so much for that answer. What do you think needs to be done to increase urban Indian representation? I mean, we're talking about voting here and all the importance of it, but how do we get that urban Indian representation? How do we get that?
In terms of voting, right? Voter engagement?
Yeah, in terms of voter engagement.
Okay. I think education and awareness and the dates. There's a lot of dates that are thrown at people, like here, Navajo Nation, Maricopa County, state of Arizona. And I think just education, getting the word out, what the dates are, making sure they're registered, and that it translates into them actually registering and voting.
Yeah, definitely registering and voting. Very important. You know, you can talk, but they got to do the walk. Raylan, same question. What needs to be done to increase urban Indian representation for voting?
I think just continually advocating and then increasing awareness. From the Urban Indian Center of Salt Lake, it was me for the Native community, and I'm one person, so it would have been nice to have more Native representation to collaborate with outside of our agency for here in Utah. And they have that Native representation in other Native or in other voting communities here in Utah.
Yeah. All right, Adam, same question to you. What needs to be done to increase urban Indian representation in voting?
I agree with Raylan and Susan on exactly that. And really for me, it's more persistence, really pushing the education. And just, we had a couple of community members that attended powwow where we handed out shirts, and I asked them there, I'm like, have you registered to vote? And they're like, no, not yet. Then they would come to the center and I saw them like, hey, good to see you. Have you registered to vote? And by the time I asked about the fifth time, they got annoyed enough where they finally went and did it. So I think persistence is really a good tool.
All right, I have one last question, and I wish we had more time because Lord knows I wrote too many, but I'm going to start with Raylan. What was one of the biggest obstacles or barriers that you were able to overcome this past year in terms of your state and getting out the vote and getting out your message? And I can repeat it again, but what was one of your biggest obstacles or barriers from this past year that you were able to overcome?
For me, it was the beginning was all about COVID-19 restrictions. So finding ways to engage. I mean, everything was at that time was media platform. And so it was really hard you had to be very generic in your messaging. So then once those COVID-19 restrictions kind of settled down and we were able to do face-to-face interactions at any community events, I think that was that's where things changed for me, and getting people to register to vote and listen to me, listen to my testimony, anything I can answer their questions one-on-one. And then another barrier was probably the politics. And, you know, when I had somebody that I could turn to for help in coming up with different advertising slogans or information. However, it was a non-native that was providing it. And so when they would say certain things, I'd be like, oh no, we can't use that. So, and he's like, well, why not? And it's like, well, you know, it was as easy as this president is a great president. And I was like, yes, that is true for the generic or for the population as a whole. Many people would think that. However, for Native Americans, this is what he did in history. So I think that's where I had to really look at a box, and it wasn't just a box, it was a cube. I had to look at all angles. What did they do for natives? What was the outcome for natives and stuff like that? So I think it was nice to hear people's input and stuff like that, but I really had to dissect anything people would provide me or want me to say or anything, and make sure I'm not offending anybody, but especially my community as a whole. So, and I think that's probably a lot of the barriers now, is that there is a lot of Native stuff out there, or there is a lot of voting stuff out there, but a lot of it's not fully tailored to just Native Americans. And I think that was probably the hardest part, is taking that and trying to tailor it to the community that I was trying to reach.
Thank you, Raylan. I love that cube idea. You know, it's not black and white. There's so much gray, and really just bringing home that message to your community adds that extra layer and looking at it. I'm going to ask that same question over to Susan, and then Adam, you're going to be finishing it off. But what was one of the biggest obstacles or barriers that you were able to overcome this past year?
So a lot of my answer is the same as Raylan's, and she said it really, really well. I think COVID at the beginning, and I think again, as COVID restrictions are lifting, and getting people interested, education, how it affects everybody, and then also making sure the messaging is on point. And for me, it's been running it through a lot of our partners locally and asking them what they think and on the messaging. And it helps when we meet as a team every week and talk about different angles. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think what Raylan said is probably, she said it really well.
Yeah, it was beautiful, really beautiful. Adam, I don't know if you can match these two ladies, but what was one of the biggest obstacles or barriers that you were able to overcome this past year?
I mean, those were a lot of them, but also for me is getting our community to believe that their vote matters. A lot of them say, oh, I'm just one person, it's not going to matter. I'm like, you can't think like that. No matter how small it is, your voice matters, your vote matters. Get out there and do it, because it may not seem like it. You could be that one vote that swings one issue a different way, and that you really truly believe in. So your vote does matter.
I'm gonna finish off the panel with that. And thank you guys so much for all your hard work this past year, and the year prior, and all that you guys are doing to get out the vote to make Native voices matter. Next slide, please. Thank you to our panelists for such an important discussion. Without your work, the work you're doing and the work that UIOs are doing and our partner at NUIFC, we would not have this opportunity today. In the words of the late Representative John Lewis, the right to vote is precious. It is almost sacred. It is the most powerful nonviolent tool we have in our democracy. As Indian country continues to face barriers and issues with voting, it is important that as a community, as individuals, we support the one vote, one family, one voice at a time message. We must be the voice for those who cannot continue to get out the vote so that the new generation can not only be heard, but also be represented. And I encourage you guys to place a heart or a clap emoji in the chat box for our wonderful panelists. They did an amazing job. Next slide, please. And I wrote like 3 paragraphs, but I'm running out of time about how voter engagement strategies should go. But what you see on the screen is a mug and shirt that we would often use in terms of getting people out to our events virtually. And I know that our panelists also use different mugs and shirts and everything with their swag. But I encourage you to go back and look at these slides and look at some of these engagement strategies. Next slide, please. I could have probably done a 2-hour seminar on resources available, but the slides will be given to you after the recording and after this is done with resources. But here are just a few. I encourage you to check out the NCUI website and the NUIFC website, as well as our panelists' websites, and check out the National Voter Registration Day. If you're not already registered to vote, they can help you register to vote, and you can send out this to anyone. Next slide, please. Here are only a few. We also have some upcoming events at NCUI that we would love for you to join. On the 28th is our Project ECHO, Explore Healthcare, Environment, Reservoirs, and how to manage the spread of germs. We have another ECHO on the 12th, exploring the COVID-19 pandemic as it relates to risk recognition in reservoirs healthcare. And then on the 14th of July, we have Broadening the Ribbon, Innovative Resources and Effective Strategies to Eliminate HIV and AIDS in Indian Country. And then on the 26th, we have another HIV event, Sharing the Red Ribbon Practice from the Front Lines. We encourage you to take our survey in the bottom corner and leave feedback if you like this session, if you want more of these sessions, if you didn't like something about this session, you can leave it in there too. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for coming to this important session. The feedback survey is also inside the chat box. Please complete it and do not hesitate if you had any comments that you want to add. Also, upcoming events and registration can be found at ncui.org/events. Thank you guys so much for coming. And with that, I was able to wrap it up right on time. Thank you guys. I really appreciate you for being here. Let me check out the chat box. How do we get a shirt and mug? Should have been to the other sessions. All right. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.